12 men entered a cave on an island looking for food and shelter. The cave belonged to a monster, a giant with one eye in the center of his forehead, who ate 2 men for breakfast, 2 more for lunch, and 2 for dinner. By the time they escaped, only half the crew was still alive. The giant was Polyphemus the Cyclops, son of Poseidon, god of the seas. The men were Odysseus and his crew, trying to sail home after 10 years fighting at Troy. They were trapped inside his cave, with a boulder blocking the exit that no human could possibly move. They had to use intelligence to escape brute strength. Odysseus blinded the Cyclops with a burning stake driven into his single eye, but that's when the real problem began, because Polyphemus was Poseidon's son. And when Odysseus revealed his real name in arrogant pride, he cursed himself to 10 more years of suffering before he could reach home. This is that story. Odysseus and his fleet had left Troy victorious after 10 years of war. They should have sailed straight home to Ithaca, but storms driven by angry gods scattered the ships and pushed them off course into unknown waters, far from any charted route. They had been wandering for weeks, seeking food and fresh water. They spotted an island with smoke rising from caves along the shore. Odysseus took 12 of his best men and rowed to investigate, leaving the rest of the fleet anchored safely offshore. They climbed to a large cave opening that showed signs of habitation. Inside, they found pens full of sheep and goats, wheels of cheese aging on racks, buckets of fresh milk. The cave was clearly occupied, but empty at the moment. Odysseus's men begged him to take what they could carry and leave immediately before the owner returned. But Odysseus wanted to meet whoever lived here. Maybe they could trade. Maybe they would offer the traditional guest gifts that hospitality required. Odysseus wanted gifts and glory. They lit a fire inside the cave and waited, helping themselves to cheese and milk. As evening approached, they heard heavy footsteps and the bleating of sheep. Something massive blocked the cave entrance. A giant shepherd drove his flock inside, then lifted an enormous boulder and sealed the cave entrance completely shut behind him. They were trapped. The giant was 12 feet tall, with a single enormous eye in the center of his forehead. Polyphemus the Cyclops, son of Poseidon. He was crude, primitive, caring nothing for the laws of hospitality that civilized people respected. He spotted the men by his fire and demanded to know who dared enter his home without permission from him. Odysseus stepped forward and claimed guest right according to the sacred laws of hospitality that even gods respected. He explained they were lost sailors returning from Troy, blown off course by storms. He asked for food and shelter in the name of Zeus, who protects all travelers and guests. Polyphemus laughed at him with genuine amusement. The Cyclops said he cared nothing for Zeus or any god. His father Poseidon was more powerful than Zeus in these waters anyway. The laws of hospitality meant nothing to him. These men had trespassed in his cave. They were his property now. He would do whatever he wanted with them. There was nothing they could do to stop him. Polyphemus asked Odysseus where his ship was anchored. Odysseus lied immediately, showing his cunning nature. He said their ship had been wrecked on the rocks, and they were the only survivors. He wanted to prevent the Cyclops from finding and destroying their only way off this island. The lie probably saved the rest of his fleet anchored offshore. Then Polyphemus reached out with hands the size of shields, grabbed 2 of Odysseus's men, and smashed them against the cave floor. Their skulls cracked like eggs. He tore them apart and ate them raw, crunching bones between his teeth, washing down their flesh with buckets of milk. The surviving men watched in absolute horror, unable to escape or fight back. After his meal, Polyphemus lay down among his sheep and fell asleep. Odysseus drew his sword and considered killing the giant right there as he slept. But then he realized the fatal problem. Even if he killed Polyphemus, they still couldn't escape. The boulder blocking the entrance was too massive for 12 men to move. If the Cyclops died, they would be sealed inside forever. They spent the night in terror, listening to the giant snore while trying to form a plan to escape this nightmare. Morning came. Polyphemus woke, lit his fire, milked his sheep, then grabbed 2 more men for breakfast. He ate them the same way he had eaten the others the night before. 8 men remained alive out of the original 12. Polyphemus moved the boulder aside just enough to let his sheep out to graze, then blocked the entrance again and left to shepherd his flock. The men were alone in the cave again. Odysseus knew they had one day to create an escape plan before Polyphemus returned and ate 2 more of them for dinner. Odysseus found a massive wooden staff lying in the cave, the Cyclops' walking stick made from an entire tree trunk. It was as thick as a ship's mast. He and his men used their swords to sharpen one end into a point, then hardened the tip in the fire until it was as hard as metal. This would be their weapon when Polyphemus returned. Evening came. Polyphemus drove his sheep back inside and sealed the boulder over the entrance once more. He milked the sheep, then grabbed 2 more men for his dinner. 6 warriors remained alive. Half the crew was dead. Odysseus knew he had to execute his plan tonight, or none of them would survive until morning. Odysseus approached Polyphemus, holding a bowl of strong, undiluted wine from his ship. He offered it to the giant as a gift, speaking politely and ingratiatingly. He said this was special wine from Troy, the finest vintage in the world. He asked the Cyclops to drink it and tell him what he thought. He was baiting a trap. Polyphemus drank the entire bowl in one gulp. His single eye widened with pleasure. He had never tasted anything so strong and delicious in his primitive island life. He demanded more. Odysseus poured him another bowl, and another, and another. The wine was meant to be mixed with water, but Polyphemus drank it pure and strong. The giant became drunk faster than Odysseus had hoped. Polyphemus asked Odysseus what his name was. In his cunning, Odysseus lied again. He said his name was Nobody. The Cyclops laughed and said he would eat. Nobody last as a gift for the wine. Then he would eat all the others first. He thought this was a great joke in generous hospitality. Polyphemus collapsed into drunken sleep among his sheep, snoring even louder than the night before. This was the moment Odysseus had been waiting for. He and his 6 surviving men grabbed the massive sharpened stake they had prepared and held its point in the fire until it glowed red-hot with heat. This was their one chance. They lifted the burning stake together, all 6 men carrying the enormous weight. They approached the sleeping giant. His single enormous eye was closed in drunken sleep. Odysseus aimed the glowing point directly at the center of that eye. He gave the signal. They drove the stake forward with all their combined strength, ramming it deep into the Cyclops' eye socket. The sound Polyphemus made was inhuman, a roar of agony that echoed through the cave and across the island. He thrashed and screamed, grabbing at the stake embedded in his eye, ripping it out in a spray of blood and fluid. His hands clawed at his ruined eye. He was blind now forever. They had destroyed his single eye completely. Polyphemus roared for help. Other Cyclopes from caves across the island heard him screaming and came to investigate. They gathered outside his sealed cave and shouted, asking what was wrong. Who was attacking him? Who was hurting him? What enemy had dared to harm him? They were ready to help take revenge on whoever had done this. Polyphemus screamed back that nobody was attacking him. Nobody had hurt him. Nobody had blinded him. The other Cyclopes were confused by this answer. If nobody was attacking him, then why was he screaming? If nobody had hurt him, then there was no problem. They told him to stop making noise and left him alone. Odysseus's lie had worked perfectly. The blinded giant collapsed in pain and rage. But he was not stupid despite his primitive nature. He knew the men were still trapped inside his cave. He moved the boulder away from the entrance, but positioned himself in the opening. He would feel each sheep as it left the cave. Any man trying to escape would be caught and torn apart. Odysseus knew they couldn't fight their way past the giant even blinded. Polyphemus was still 12 feet tall with strength that could crush them easily. They needed to escape invisibly. Odysseus looked at the sheep milling around the cave and understood how they would get out. He formed his final desperate plan while Polyphemus raged in the entrance. Polyphemus kept long willow branches in his cave for weaving. Odysseus and his men used these to tie the sheep together in groups of 3 side by side. Under the middle sheep of each group, they tied one man, clinging to the sheep's belly upside down. The sheep would hide the men from Polyphemus's searching hands as he felt them leaving. Odysseus chose the largest ram in the flock for himself. It was a massive animal with thick wool. He didn't tie himself underneath like the others. Instead, he clung to its belly directly, wrapping his arms and legs around its body, hidden in its thick fleece. He was gambling that Polyphemus would let his prize ram pass without inspecting it too carefully. Morning came. The sheep were eager to leave the cave and reach their grazing pastures. They pressed toward the entrance, where blind Polyphemus sat feeling each animal as it passed. He ran his hands over their backs carefully, searching for men trying to escape riding on the sheep. He didn't think to check underneath them, where the men hung hidden. One by one, the tied groups of 3 sheep passed through the entrance, with men clinging underneath. Polyphemus felt their backs and let them pass, not detecting the warriors escaping beneath. 5 men made it out this way successfully. Finally, Odysseus's ram approached the entrance, moving slower than the others because of the extra weight it carried clinging to its belly. Polyphemus felt the ram and noticed it was moving last when it usually led the flock. He spoke to it fondly, saying his favorite ram must be sad that its master had been blinded. He ran his hands along its back and sides affectionately, but he didn't check underneath where Odysseus clung to its fleece, holding his breath in absolute silence and terror. The ram passed through. Odysseus was outside the cave for the first time in days. Once the ram was far enough from the entrance, Odysseus dropped to the ground and untied his men from the other sheep. All 6 survivors had escaped. They drove the Cyclops' entire flock ahead of them, running toward their ship pulled up on the beach. They had won through intelligence against impossible strength. They loaded the sheep onto their ship and pushed off from shore as fast as they could row. They should have left in silence. They should have been grateful to escape alive. But Odysseus's pride and arrogance overcame his usual cunning intelligence. He couldn't resist shouting back to the island. This was his fatal mistake that would curse him for 10 more years. Odysseus shouted to Polyphemus that if anyone asked who had blinded him, it was not nobody. It was Odysseus of Ithaca, son of Laertes, sacker of cities. He wanted the glory and recognition for outwitting the Cyclops. He wanted his name attached to this victory. He revealed his identity when he should have stayed silent and anonymous. His pride destroyed him. Polyphemus heard the name and knew where to direct his vengeance. He lifted an enormous boulder, larger than their ship, and hurled it toward Odysseus's voice. The massive stone landed in the water just in front of their ship, creating a wave that pushed them back toward shore. They rowed desperately away, barely escaping. They should have learned. Odysseus should have stayed quiet. But Odysseus shouted back again. He mocked the blinded Cyclops. His men begged him to stop, warning that he would bring disaster on all of them if he kept taunting the giant. Odysseus ignored them. He shouted his name again. He shouted his homeland. He wanted Polyphemus to remember exactly who had defeated him. This was the curse taking hold. Polyphemus called out to his father Poseidon, god of the seas. He prayed for revenge against Odysseus, who had blinded him. He begged Poseidon to ensure that Odysseus never reached home, or if the fates decreed he must reach home eventually, let it be late and in terrible suffering. Let all his companions die. Let him find trouble waiting in his house. Poseidon heard his son's prayer. Poseidon answered the prayer. He cursed Odysseus to wander the seas for 10 more years. Every storm would blow him off course. Every island would bring new disasters. His entire crew would die. He would reach home eventually, but only after losing everything and everyone. All because Odysseus couldn't stay silent. All because he needed the glory of revealing his name. Odysseus had outwitted the monster through intelligence and cunning. He had saved himself and his men from impossible odds. He had blinded a giant and escaped a death trap. But his pride and need for recognition turned victory into curse. The man who survived through cleverness was destroyed by his inability to remain anonymous. He earned 10 more years of suffering for one moment of arrogant pride. This is the story of Polyphemus the Cyclops. Not a simple monster story. A tragedy about intelligence defeating strength, then pride destroying the intelligent man. Odysseus won the battle. He lost the war because he couldn't accept winning quietly. He needed everyone to know he had won. And that need for glory cost him everything. 10 years fighting at Troy, 10 more years cursed at sea. All because he couldn't keep his mouth shut.